It was late afternoon in downtown Seattle, and the streets were still busy with people coming in and out of shops before sunset. A light drizzle had begun, the kind that coated everything with a thin mist but wasn't heavy enough for umbrellas. Among the crowd, a quiet Japanese woman named Aiko walked down the sidewalk, holding a small shopping list in her hand. She had just finished a long week of work and wanted to pick up a few things before heading home. Nothing fancy, just groceries and some cleaning supplies. She looked calm and ordinary, dressed neatly in a gray coat, her dark hair tied back in a low ponytail. She stepped into a medium-sized local store that she often visited. The store was warm inside, with the smell of coffee drifting from a small cafe corner. Aiko took a basket and began picking out her usual items, some fruit, bread, and a few other essentials. She moved quietly, smiling politely when someone brushed past her. She had lived in the city for several years and was used to blending in. She wasn't the kind of person who liked attention. When she got to the counter, she placed her items neatly on the conveyor belt. The young cashier, who looked like a college student, greeted her in a friendly way. Aiko nodded, returning a gentle smile. She reached into her purse, took out her checkbook, and wrote a check for the total amount. The cashier took the check, glanced at it, and froze for a second. His cheerful expression faded. He frowned slightly and looked at Aiko, then back at the check. I'll just need to get my manager to approve this," he said, his tone suddenly uncertain. Aiko, unaware of any issue, nodded calmly. "That's fine," she said softly. The cashier walked to a nearby office, holding the check carefully, whispering something to a man in a dark vest, probably the manager. Aiko waited patiently, her hands folded in front of her. She had written many checks before, and nothing unusual had ever happened. But after a minute or two, she noticed both the cashier and the manager looking at her from across the counter, whispering again. The cashier looked uncomfortable, and the manager looked suspicious. Finally, the manager approached the counter, holding the check between his fingers as if it were something dirty. "Ma'am," he said stiffly, "we can't accept this. It doesn't look right." Aiko blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" she said politely. "What's wrong with it?" He tapped the paper with his finger. "This check looks fake. The account name doesn't match the regular format we see here. It says it's from a government division, but I don't think this is real." Aiko looked at the check and then back at the manager. "It's valid," she said quietly. "That's a federal account. You can call to verify it." The manager crossed his arms. "That's not necessary. We've seen these scams before. Someone writes a check claiming it's from a government account and it always bounces." The cashier shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, clearly unsure what to do. Aiko tried to stay calm. "Sir," she said, still polite but firm, "there's a misunderstanding. That check is legitimate." But the manager didn't want to listen. He turned to the cashier. "Call the police. Tell them we've got someone trying to pass a fake government check." The cashier hesitated, glancing at Aiko, who stood completely still, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Yes, I'm sure," the manager snapped. "Better safe than sorry." Aiko's stomach tightened, but she didn't show it. She had faced worse situations before. Still, being accused in public felt humiliating. People nearby started to notice something was going on. A few customers slowed down, pretending to browse while sneaking glances toward the counter. The cashier reluctantly picked up the phone and called the local police. Aiko could hear bits of the conversation, words like possible fraud and fake check. She looked down at her hands and took a slow breath. There was no point arguing now. Once the police were involved, it would be best to let them handle it. 10 minutes later, 2 officers walked into the store. Both looked serious, one older with gray hair and another younger, probably still new to the job. They walked up to the counter and the manager immediately pointed at Aiko. "That's her," he said, his voice low but firm. "She tried to use a fake check." The officers looked at Aiko. "Ma'am, is that true?" the older one asked. "No," Aiko replied softly. "The check is valid." "They didn't even try to verify it." The younger officer stepped forward. "Can we see your ID?" Aiko reached into her purse and handed over her driver's license. The older officer studied it briefly but didn't seem satisfied. "And what do you do for a living, ma'am?" Aiko hesitated for a second, choosing her words carefully. "I work with the government," she said simply. The manager snorted quietly. "Yeah, that's what they all say." The younger officer sighed. "Ma'am, do you have any proof of employment?" Aiko opened her wallet and showed another ID card, but the officer didn't even look closely before shaking his head. "This doesn't look official to me," he said. "We've seen a lot of fakes." She felt a flicker of frustration but didn't raise her voice. "If you call the number on the check," she said, "you'll reach the department I work with. They can verify it immediately." The manager folded his arms. "She's stalling. I've dealt with people like this before. They try to make you second guess." The older officer seemed to agree. "All right, ma'am, I think it's best if you come with us while we sort this out." Aiko's eyes softened. "You're arresting me?" she asked, her voice calm but low. "It's just for questioning," the officer replied quickly, though his tone carried authority. "Please turn around." Aiko didn't resist. She slowly turned around as one officer pulled out handcuffs. A hush fell over the store. The few customers who were still shopping stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene quietly. The cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. Aiko stared straight ahead, not saying a word. The embarrassment was heavy, but she refused to let it show. The cashier looked uneasy, his hands trembling slightly as he avoided her gaze. The manager, however, looked satisfied, as if he'd just prevented some major crime. They led her out of the store. The rain had picked up, and drops fell softly on her hair and coat as they guided her to the patrol car parked by the curb. Someone across the street watched with wide eyes, whispering to a friend. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked like another criminal being caught red-handed. Inside the car, Aiko sat quietly in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her. The younger officer drove while the older one called the station on his radio. She listened silently as he described her as a suspect in a check fraud case. The words stung not because she was afraid, but because they were so wrong. The drive to the precinct took only 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the city lights outside. Aiko stared out quietly, her face calm but her thoughts running fast. She thought about how easily people could jump to conclusions, how her calmness was mistaken for guilt, her politeness seen as weakness. When they arrived, the officers guided her inside, removing her cuffs only after she was seated in a small interview room. It smelled of coffee and cleaning spray, and the lights above flickered slightly. She sat straight, her posture steady, while the officers stepped outside to talk. Through the small window in the door, she could see them laughing, one of them shaking his head as if this were all routine. She took another slow breath. Her pulse was steady. She had dealt with situations far more dangerous than this, just not ones this unfair. She looked down at her hands, still slightly red from the cuffs, and thought about how strange it felt to be treated like a criminal in her own country of service. Meanwhile, back at the store, the cashier was still shaken. He had felt something wasn't right about how everything unfolded. The manager was already telling the story to another employee, describing how he caught a scammer. But the cashier couldn't shake the image of Aiko's calm eyes. There had been no fear in them, just quiet patience, as if she knew something no one else did. As Aiko sat waiting in that small room, the rain outside grew heavier. Hours would pass before anyone realized who she really was, but at that moment she sat in silence, her calmness unnerving even to the officers who had brought her in. They couldn't tell, but she wasn't just another citizen with a bad check. She was someone whose name, if searched properly, would change the entire tone of the night. But for now she waited, still, quiet, and unshaken, as the sound of rain against the window filled the room, and the mistake that had begun over a simple check slowly started to spiral into something much bigger than anyone in that station could have imagined. The clock on the wall ticked slowly as Aiko sat in the small gray room. The sound of rain tapping against the window was the only thing that broke the silence. It had been over an hour since she was brought in, and no one had said much to her since. She kept her back straight and her hands folded on the metal table, her eyes calm but focused. Every few minutes a shadow would pass by the small window on the door, and she could hear bits of conversation coming from outside. The older officer, the one who had arrested her, finally came back into the room with a folder in his hand. He looked tired, maybe even irritated. He dropped the folder on the table and sat down across from her. His name tag said Henderson. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "All right, ma'am," he said, sounding like someone who had done this 100 times before. "You want to explain to me what's going on with this check? Because right now it looks fake." Aiko looked at him quietly for a moment before speaking. There's nothing to explain. It's a government-issued account. If you call the number on it, they can confirm that. Henderson gave a small laugh, one that didn't reach his eyes. You think I haven't heard that before? You know how many people try that line? They all say their checks are government-issued. Then it bounces and they vanish. She didn't respond to his sarcasm. Instead, she said gently, "You didn't even verify it before you brought me here." He leaned back in his chair. "We will. But first you need to tell us who you really are. You say you work with the government." "What department?" Aiko paused. "I can't share that information without clearance." That made Henderson raise an eyebrow. "Without clearance?" He chuckled again, shaking his head. "That's a good one. You can't expect me to believe that." "I'm not asking you to believe," Aiko said softly. "I'm asking you to check." Henderson rubbed his forehead, clearly frustrated. "Ma'am, you're not making this easier for yourself. We could hold you for fraud. You understand that?" She nodded. Yes, her calmness unsettled him. Most people panicked when they were accused of something like this. They cried, shouted, or begged to be let go. But this woman, she sat there with the same quiet look as when she first walked in. It made him feel like he was missing something, though he couldn't tell what. He sighed and stood up. "I'll be back." When the door closed behind him, Aiko looked down at her hands again. Her wrists still had faint marks from the handcuffs. She rubbed them gently and then folded her arms on the table. The clock kept ticking. The rain outside had turned into a steady downpour, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Outside the room, the younger officer, the one who had been driving the car earlier, stood near the counter holding her ID card. His name tag said Reed. He looked at it again, confused. "Hey, Henderson," he said. "This ID doesn't pull up anything." Henderson frowned. "What do you mean?" "I ran her name through the regular system, the DMV, and even the state records. Nothing. It just says restricted access. I've never seen that before." Henderson frowned deeper. "Probably a glitch. Try running it again." Reed typed on the keyboard, his face lit by the monitor's glow. "I did 3 times. Same thing. It says access denied, restricted federal record." Henderson's expression changed slightly. He tried to act like it didn't bother him, but it did. "That's odd. Maybe it's an error. The system's been weird lately." Reed looked unsure. "You don't think she's telling the truth, do you?" Henderson hesitated. "We'll find out soon enough. Send a copy of the check to the fraud department. Let them confirm it." Reed nodded and began scanning the check. As the machine hummed, Henderson went back to his desk and sat down heavily. Something about this didn't feel right. He had seen plenty of fake checks, but the woman's calm voice kept echoing in his head. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't afraid. She just kept asking them to verify it. Back in the room, Aiko sat alone. She could hear the faint sound of a printer somewhere down the hall, and voices talking softly. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone realized their mistake. Still, the whole experience felt heavy, being accused, judged, and humiliated in public. She had dealt with far more dangerous people in her work, but nothing felt as quietly painful as being treated like a liar when you were telling the truth. After a while, the door opened again. This time, the younger officer, Reed, stepped in. He looked nervous but polite. "Ma'am," he said, "can I get you some water?" Aiko nodded. "Thank you." He placed a small paper cup in front of her. "We're just waiting for verification, all right?" "Shouldn't be long. Thank you," she said again. Her tone was calm, but her eyes studied him. He seemed different from the older one. Less sure of himself, more human. She could tell he wasn't comfortable with the way things were going. He gave a small smile before stepping out again. When he returned to his desk, Henderson was on the phone. "Yeah," Henderson was saying, his tone sharper now. "I just need a confirmation. The check's from some federal account. Looks weird, but..." He paused, frowning as he listened. "What do you mean it's restricted? What do you mean you can't access it?" His voice lowered and he turned his back slightly, glancing toward the interview room. Reed could hear bits of the conversation. Henderson's tone had changed. "Okay, fine," he said finally, his voice uncertain. "If it's that serious, then someone needs to explain what's going on here." He hung up slowly and looked at Reed. "You said her record was restricted, right?" Reed nodded. "Yeah, it blocked me out completely." Henderson rubbed the back of his neck. "They just told me the same thing about the check. Apparently, the account is linked to some classified division." Reed blinked. Classified division? What does that even mean? Henderson didn't answer. He was staring at the door to the interview room. A strange feeling crept over him, the kind that comes when you realize you might have made a very big mistake. He got up and walked back to the room. Aiko was still sitting exactly where he left her. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "can you tell me again who you work for?" Aiko looked up, her calm gaze meeting his. "I already told you," she said. "I can't share that. Because it's classified?" he asked almost sarcastically. "Yes." He sighed, sitting down again. "You understand how that sounds, right? You walk into a store, write a check no one can verify, you get arrested, and now you're saying you can't tell us where you work. You see how this looks?" Aiko nodded. "I do. But that doesn't make it untrue." He stared at her for a long moment. The clock ticked in the silence between them. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood up. "All right," he muttered. "I'll make another call." This time, he didn't call the local fraud department. He called a contact at the Federal Liaison Office, a number he rarely used. When the operator answered, he gave Aiko's name. The silence that followed on the other end was long and uncomfortable. "Sir," the operator finally said, "where exactly did you get this name?" Henderson frowned. "She's here at the precinct. We brought her in for—" The operator cut him off sharply. "You need to hold that woman in a secure area immediately and wait for federal personnel. Do not question her further." Henderson froze. "Wait, what? Why? Who is she?" The operator's tone was firm. "Just do it. They'll be there shortly." Then the line went dead. Henderson lowered the phone slowly, staring at it. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he looked at Reed. "Something's not right," he said quietly. "They told me to stop questioning her." Reed frowned. "Stop? Why?" Henderson shook his head. "They wouldn't tell me. But they're sending someone." Back in the interview room, Aiko sat quietly, sipping the water she had been given. She could sense the shift outside, the quiet tension, the whispered voices. She had seen this kind of nervous confusion before. It always came right before people realized they had made a big mistake. She looked toward the window as a flash of lightning lit the room for a moment. Her reflection stared back at her, tired but calm. She had tried to avoid all this. She had given them chances to check, to listen, to verify. But people rarely listened when they thought they were right. Outside, Henderson paced back and forth, glancing at the clock. He didn't know what to do. Reed tried to make sense of the whole thing, scrolling through the database again, hoping for something that made sense. But there was nothing. Just that same red warning message. Restricted federal record. Minutes turned into an hour. The rain finally began to slow, leaving the streets outside glistening under the city lights. Henderson sat back at his desk, tapping his pen nervously. He was starting to realize that whatever this woman was involved in, it was far above his rank. And in that small, dimly lit room, Aiko waited patiently, knowing that soon the truth would come out. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She just sat there, calm and steady, while the station around her slowly began to understand that the woman they had handcuffed and brought in for a fake check wasn't who they thought she was at all. The lights in the precinct hallway flickered slightly as the night wore on. The rain had stopped outside, but the air still felt damp and heavy. Aiko sat quietly in the small room, still calm, though the hours had stretched long. She could sense something had changed. Voices outside the door were softer now, uncertain, and there was a different tone in them. People were no longer laughing or acting confident. They were whispering. Something had clearly shifted. Officer Henderson sat at his desk in the main area, staring at the phone. He had called the federal office over an hour ago, and since then the entire precinct had gone uneasy. His superior, Captain Doyle, had arrived not long after, demanding to know why a suspect was being held under classified circumstances. Henderson tried to explain, but he didn't have much to say. He only repeated what he had been told, that federal personnel were on their way and that they were not to question Aiko any further. The captain didn't like that answer. "We don't just hold people because someone in Washington says so," he said sharply. "What exactly is this about?" Henderson rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know, sir. But the woman's record is restricted. Even the check she used, it's from a federal financial division. They told me to stop all questioning immediately." The captain frowned. "Restricted?" On a civilian? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't, Henderson admitted quietly. But I have a bad feeling about it. Reed, the younger officer, stood nearby listening. He looked anxious. Sir, I really think she's not who we think she is, he said softly. She doesn't act like someone who's scared. She's just waiting. The captain gave him a skeptical look. Waiting for what? Reed hesitated. For someone to realize the mistake we made. The captain sighed, then glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Fine. Keep her in there until we get confirmation. But no more questions. If she's really tied to something federal, I don't want to step on the wrong toes. Henderson nodded, though he still looked uneasy. He couldn't shake the image of Aiko sitting there, perfectly calm, as if she had seen this happen before. Meanwhile, inside the interview room, Aiko watched the reflections of the hallway lights on the window. Her thoughts were quiet but sharp. She knew the call must have reached the right people by now. It always took time for information like this to travel through the proper channels. She had worked with law enforcement before. She knew how slow the system could be when it came to classified identities. She had wanted to avoid pulling rank or revealing who she was, but being handcuffed in a grocery store and brought here left her little choice. It wasn't pride that kept her calm, it was discipline. Over the years, she had learned that staying still and silent often spoke louder than anger ever could. A few minutes later, the door opened slightly, and Officer Reed stepped in. He held a file in his hands, though he didn't open it. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to say. Ma'am, he started, his voice low. Are you all right? Do you need anything? Coffee, maybe? Aiko gave a small nod. Water is fine. Thank you. Reed nodded and disappeared for a moment, returning with another paper cup of water. He placed it in front of her carefully, as though he didn't want to seem disrespectful. Thank you, she said softly. Reed lingered by the door for a moment. Look, I know this whole thing seems bad, he said hesitantly. But I just want you to know. I don't think you did anything wrong. She looked at him calmly. Then why am I still here? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, not sure how to answer. We're just waiting for someone, he said finally. Aiko gave a small, understanding nod. I know. When he left, she sipped the water slowly. The walls felt close, but she wasn't restless. Every few minutes, she heard phones ringing in the distance and doors opening and closing. The rhythm of the building was changing. It was the kind of quiet that meant people were nervous. Out in the main office, Reed sat down near Henderson, lowering his voice. Sir, I think we should apologize to her, he said. Henderson gave him a tired look. You can't apologize for something until you know what you did. Reed shook his head. We arrested her in public. We didn't even check properly. What if she's... Before he could finish, the phone on Henderson's desk rang again. He picked it up quickly. Yes, this is Officer Henderson. He listened for a few seconds, and his expression changed almost instantly. His eyes widened slightly and his voice grew quieter. Yes, she's still here. Understood. He hung up slowly. Reed watched him. Who was that? Henderson didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hand. That was the Bureau, he said finally. They're sending people over. They said she's part of a classified task force. Reed blinked. What? Yeah, Henderson said softly. They didn't say what division. Just that we're not supposed to release any information about her or the arrest. They're on their way now. Reed sat back stunned. So she was telling the truth. Looks like it, Henderson muttered. And we just handcuffed a federal agent in front of a crowd for trying to use her own check. The captain came out of his office just then, adjusting his uniform jacket. What's going on? Henderson hesitated. Sir, we just got confirmation. The woman we brought in, she's a federal agent, the captain froze. What kind of agent? They wouldn't say, Henderson replied. Only that we shouldn't have her here. The captain exhaled slowly, his face tightening. This is bad. Really bad. Reed looked toward the hallway. Should we tell her? Not yet, Henderson said quickly. They'll be here soon. Let them handle it. Minutes dragged by and the tension in the room grew thicker. The officers spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with each other. Even the few people who hadn't been involved in the arrest could feel that something serious was happening. Then, around 1 a.m, the sound of car doors closing echoed outside. 2 black vehicles had pulled up in front of the precinct. The glass doors at the entrance opened and 3 people stepped in, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark suits. They walked with quiet confidence, showing badges that none of the officers dared question. Henderson immediately stood up. "Officers from Washington?" The taller man nodded. "Special Agent Collins, Department of Federal Affairs," he said briefly. "We're here for Agent Tanaka." "Agent Tanaka," Henderson repeated under his breath. It sounded strange to hear the name said like that, official and respectful. The woman in the suit spoke next. "We need to see her immediately." Henderson led them down the hallway, his heart pounding. Reed followed a few steps behind, his mind still trying to process everything. When they reached the interview room, Henderson opened the door slowly. Eiko looked up, her expression calm as ever. The moment she saw the agents, her posture shifted slightly, relieved but still composed. The woman in the suit stepped forward. "Agent Tanaka," she said softly. "We're sorry for the delay." Eiko nodded once. "It's all right." Henderson stepped back awkwardly as one of the agents uncuffed her and handed her a small folder. She took it, tucked it under her arm, and stood up gracefully. The agents treated her with quiet respect, clearly knowing who she was and what she represented. Before she left the room, she turned toward Henderson and Reed. Her tone was calm, without anger. "I tried to tell you," she said simply. Henderson swallowed hard. "I know, I'm sorry." Her eyes softened just a little. "You were doing your job," she said. "But next time, listen before you judge." She stepped out of the room, walking between the two agents as they guided her down the hall. The entire precinct had gone silent. Every officer stood up as she passed, unsure what to say. She didn't look around or demand anything. She just walked quietly toward the exit, the rain-soaked streetlights casting faint reflections on the floor. As the doors closed behind her, Henderson let out a long breath and sat down heavily in his chair. Reed stood beside him, still stunned. "Sir," he said quietly, "we arrested a federal agent." Henderson nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his temples. "And I think we just made one of the biggest mistakes of our careers." Outside, Eiko stepped into the cool air. The night was still damp, and the city lights glowed softly through the mist. One of the agents opened the car door for her, and she got in without a word. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the quiet streets. Inside the precinct, no one spoke for a while. The captain stood in the hallway, staring at the empty room where Eiko had sat just an hour ago. He didn't say it aloud, but everyone there knew that this night would not be forgotten. It would be talked about for years, a reminder of how quickly assumptions can turn into mistakes, and how a quiet woman with calm eyes could unsettle an entire department, simply by telling the truth and waiting for it to reveal itself. The precinct felt unusually quiet that night. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed softer, like everyone was holding their breath. Inside, Henderson sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall, still trying to process what had just happened. Reed leaned against a filing cabinet, his arms crossed, and kept glancing at the interview room where Eiko had been held. The absence of her calm presence left the space oddly empty, as if the energy she had carried had lingered long after she was gone. Eiko, however, was far from idle. She sat in the back seat of a black SUV, the rain-soaked streets reflecting against the glass as the vehicle moved smoothly through the quiet city. Beside her were the two federal agents who had come to escort her. One, a tall man with short-cropped hair, introduced himself as Collins, while the other, a woman with a sharp gaze, stayed slightly behind, observing everything with careful attention. Neither spoke more than necessary, respecting the space and composure of the agent they were protecting. Eiko opened the folder one of them had handed her. Inside were official documents outlining the incident at the precinct, including reports from the local officers and copies of the check she had attempted to use. She scanned the pages quickly but thoroughly. It was not the kind of paperwork she normally dealt with, but it was important to understand exactly how the situation had escalated. Mistakes like this could have long-lasting effects if not handled properly. Collins cleared his throat quietly. "Agent Tanaka, the local precinct needs a full report on your presence and status. They acted in good faith, but they need to be briefed correctly to prevent future incidents." Eiko nodded. "I understand. We need to correct what happened immediately. It could have escalated if we weren't careful." He glanced at her, noticing the calm certainty in her tone. "You handled yourself well back there. I know it wasn't easy being accused publicly." She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't meant to be easy. Discipline is part of the job. Patience is part of the work. The SUV slowed as it approached a secure parking area behind a nondescript building. It was quiet here, away from the main streets, the kind of place where people rarely noticed who came and went. The agent stepped out first, followed by Aiko. They moved quickly but smoothly, their steps confident. Even under the circumstances, she carried herself with grace and quiet authority. Inside the building, the team led her to a private briefing room. It was modest but well-equipped, with a long table and several chairs, a screen on the wall, and secure communication devices. Collins gestured for her to sit while he spoke briefly to another agent on a phone. "They want a full debrief on the incident," he said once he hung up. "We need to make sure the local officers understand exactly what happened. They don't need names or details about operations, just verification that you are legitimate, and their actions were a misunderstanding." Aiko nodded. "I'll handle it. They need to know the truth, but I also need to maintain operational security. Nothing classified should be disclosed." Collins studied her for a moment. "You make it look effortless. Most people would have lost their composure under the same circumstances." Aiko leaned back slightly, her fingers clasped together on the table. "It's not about looking effortless. It's about staying effective. Panic only makes situations worse." The two agents exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging her experience and authority. They both knew she had faced far more dangerous situations than a misjudged check at a local store. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Henderson and Reed were still processing the aftermath. The captain had left for the night, clearly disturbed by how events had unfolded. Henderson stared at the now empty interview room, remembering every detail. The calm look on her face, the quiet patience she had maintained, and the way the precinct staff had been caught completely off guard. "Reed," he said quietly, "do you realize what we almost did?" Reed nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "We could have embarrassed ourselves so badly, or worse. We could have interfered with a federal operation." Henderson ran his hands through his hair. "And the worst part? We judged her before we even tried to understand. We assumed, we jumped to conclusions. We treated her like a criminal when she was just doing her job." Reed looked down, silent for a moment. "I just hope we can make it right." "She didn't deserve any of that." Henderson sighed. "We'll be hearing from the federal office soon. They'll want reports, explanations, and maybe even apologies. But tonight is a lesson." In the briefing room, Aiko went over the report she was going to send. Every detail was precise, every word carefully considered. She knew how quickly misinformation could spread, and her goal was to ensure that the story reflected the truth while protecting her identity and the integrity of her work. It was delicate work, but she had spent years managing situations just like this. The door opened quietly and a junior agent entered with a secure laptop. "Agent Tanaka, the communication line is ready. You can send your report directly to the Federal Liaison Office and the local precinct supervisors simultaneously." She nodded and began typing. Her hands moved quickly, the screen reflecting off her focused eyes. Every sentence had to convey the right message, clarifying her identity without revealing sensitive operational details. She finished the report and read it over once before sending it. Within minutes, she received confirmation that the local precinct had received it. She leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a brief moment to relax. The tension from the past few hours still lingered, but the immediate crisis was over. Collins observed her quietly. "You make it look simple," he said again, though this time with a faint smile. Aiko gave a small nod. "Simplicity is often the product of preparation and discipline. What looks simple is usually anything but." Collins chuckled softly. "I can see that. Well, you handled it perfectly. The precinct will be informed and there won't be any more misunderstandings." She allowed herself another small smile, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Good. That is the most important thing." Later, the agents escorted her to a secure vehicle again. This time, they took a different route, ensuring that no one would recognize the car or track their movements. Aiko didn't speak much during the ride, her mind focused on the follow-up steps. She knew that a formal briefing with the precinct would take place the next day, and she had to ensure that the officers involved understood the gravity of the mistake without causing embarrassment or confrontation. When they arrived at the federal office, she stepped out of the car with the same calm composure she had shown all night. Inside, she was greeted with the quiet respect that came naturally to her colleagues. No one treated her as a suspect or even as someone in trouble. She was simply Agent Tanaka, a professional doing her job, and everyone in the room understood that implicitly. The briefing room at the office was different from the one in the precinct. It was spacious, brightly lit, and equipped with communication systems that allowed for secure video conferences. She was seated at the head of the table, a position she had earned through years of experience and trust. Agents and supervisors from different divisions joined the meeting, all waiting for her explanation of the events. Aiko began calmly, recounting the sequence of events without dramatization or accusation. She described the store visit, the check, the initial misunderstanding, and the arrest. Her words were measured, precise, and respectful. She emphasized the importance of clear communication between federal and local authorities, noting how assumptions and lack of verification had caused unnecessary tension. Throughout her explanation, no one interrupted. They listened, taking notes and occasionally exchanging glances that reflected a mix of surprise and respect. Her composure and clarity left a strong impression. By the end of the briefing, the entire room understood exactly how the situation had escalated and how it could have been prevented. Collins spoke last. The local precinct handled this in good faith, but it's clear there were missteps. Agent Tanaka managed the situation with professionalism and calm, preventing a potential public incident. We'll be sending an official notice and follow-up report to ensure the misunderstanding is corrected and that all officers involved are properly informed. Aiko nodded. That is sufficient. The goal is to prevent repetition and maintain trust between local authorities and federal operations. After the briefing, she was escorted to a secure area where she could rest briefly. She took off her coat, loosened her hair, and allowed herself a few minutes to breathe deeply. The night had been long, filled with tension and uncertainty, but it had ended without further incident. Her calm, patient approach had prevented embarrassment, protected operational security, and ensured the safety of everyone involved. Outside, the city was quiet now. The rain had stopped completely, leaving streets that glistened under the lights. It had been a night of mistakes, misunderstandings, and unexpected lessons for many people. But for Aiko, it was another moment to demonstrate that discipline, patience, and clarity could navigate even the most uncomfortable situations successfully. As she looked out at the city from the office window, she allowed herself a small private smile. The world often rushed to judgment, and people often acted before they understood. But she knew that staying calm, letting the truth unfold, and responding with clarity and professionalism was always the strongest path. And tonight, that approach had turned a potentially humiliating situation into a lesson that would resonate for a long time. Henderson and Reed, back at the precinct, had begun the follow-up process. They called the officers who had been on duty, explaining the situation and providing reassurance. The report sent from Aiko's office clarified the misunderstanding and detailed how officers should handle similar situations in the future. Both men reflected quietly on their actions, understanding how easily assumptions could lead to mistakes. By the end of the night, the precinct was calm again. The lessons were clear, the officers humbled but wiser, and the respect for discipline and professionalism restored. And somewhere in the city, Aiko continued her work quietly, embodying the calm strength and quiet authority that had prevented a simple misunderstanding from becoming a major incident. The morning after the incident, the precinct felt different. The tension that had hung over tea,